We're back for another round with our tulip quilt, and this time we're going to learn how to do some background free motion quilting in that center panel area. Let's get to it. When you begin stitching, choose a spot to start that will be relatively inconspicuous. I'm starting at the point of a swirl. I'm stitching a background fill design here that I call improvisational pluming. If you've been through the third volume of my Fast and Free DVD, then you may realize that this design is kind of a crossbreed between the Plumify It design and the rudimentary Plumify It design. Basically, I'm stitching lovely plume shapes somewhat randomly. Sometimes they are stitched in loose pairs or triplets, and sometimes they are stitched almost in loose chains of plumes. I allow myself the liberty to completely change the direction of my stitching if space is tight, or if I think the design may be more interesting this way. What I really want you to notice, though, is how flexible any plume-based design can be. As I approach an applique shape, I can either stretch out or contract a plume as necessary, and the design will still always look great. One thing I want you to remember here is that there are either 3 layers or 2 layers of batting underneath this entire center section, and yet it's very easy for me to quilt this section in spite of that. My needle has no trouble going through all these layers, and it's pretty easy for me to move this quilt across the machine bed. All of this will change a bit once this center section is completely done, but I want you to know that it's not really creating much of a challenge yet. Some of the spaces between applique shapes are small, and I pretty much improvise my way around them. Sometimes this means quilting a smaller version of the background fill design, and sometimes it means stitching something completely different. If I need to switch to a completely different design, I try to honor the attributes of the main design. For example, sticking with a design that's curvaceous instead of a design composed of lines and angles. The background fabric in this center section is a hand-dyed cotton sateen. All cotton sateens have a bit of a sheen or a luster to them, and because of that, they throw off really wonderful shadows once you quilt them. Because my fabric has a bit of a luster, I would not use a cotton thread to quilt this fabric because it has a flat or a matte finish, and that would cause it to stand out against this background. Here, I'm using a solid rayon thread that's fairly close in color to the background fabric, but I could have just as easily used a filament polyester or a trilobal polyester thread for this project. In general, if I'm quilting any fabric with even a hint of a sheen to it, I'm also going to use a thread with a sheen as well. Notice that as I work close to the areas of the heavy upholstery braid, stitching becomes a challenge. That heavy braid is a formidable object to come up against, and I don't want to get too close to it or it will break my free motion foot. Would you like to make a guess as to how I know that? As more and more of this center panel is quilted, you can really begin to appreciate the wonderful textural effect of this trapunto. For this particular quilt, we had a trapunto layer of wool batting under all of our applique shapes, and then a trapunto layer of silk batting underneath the center section. There is another layer of silk batting underneath the entire quilt. Whew, that is a lot of batting. Okay, so we've quilted that entire center panel, and now we've got to do something with that heavy upholstery braid. Let's get back to the machine, and I'll show you how to handle a heavy braid like that one. I am going bare here. Notice that all you are seeing is my sewing machine needle, and there is no free motion foot on my machine right now. My machine is set up in free motion mode, and I really am doing free motion machine quilting, but there is no free motion foot. My goal for this phase of quilting is to quilt the edge of the braid, and if my free motion foot were on, I wouldn't be able to get my needle close enough to the braid, and if I accidentally did, it would eventually break my foot. Notice that this works identically to free motion quilting when the free motion foot is on, except that I've lost the luxury of the foot holding down the surface of the quilt. As you can probably see, this really is a bit of a nuisance because every time my needle lifts up, the quilt comes up along with it, creating a kind of bouncing phenomenon. The only way I can try to work around this is to stabilize the quilt with my hands fairly close to the needle itself. And if you try this, you've got to be very careful here because you can easily stitch right through your finger doing this. You'd be surprised how many quilters I've met who have stitched through their fingers even with the free motion foot on, so know that this really can happen.
Yow!
The challenge of working with Trapunto is now evident. The center section is very heavy and somewhat stiff, but the real challenge is that it now wants to move as an entire unit. This creates some difficulties as I work because I can no longer easily bend it and make it behave in a way that isn't pulling against me. Again, this is hardly an insurmountable challenge, but I point this out to let you know that as you quilt a quilt with trapuntoed areas, the larger the trapuntoed area, the more of a challenge it will become due to its extra bulk and weight. Because it is so concentrated in this center panel, it is definitely a force to be reckoned with. You have probably noticed that although I'm using invisible thread in my top needle, I don't have that small size 60/8 Microtex Sharps needle in place. Instead, I'm using a size 80/12 Sharps needle, and that's because that small needle would break very easily if it were stitching into this heavy braid, and because my needle holes will be hidden by the braid, there is no longer any need to use that ultra small needle. Once I'm done stitching around the inside edge of this heavy braid, I'll move to the outer edge and do the exact same thing. Once that outer edge is done, it's time to start working on the outer border. And that's a taste of how to work with heavily trapuntoed areas and heavy embellishments like that really heavy upholstery braid. Now, if you've never done work like this before, it may seem like a big deal to you, but honestly, it's not, and it's really well worth the extra time and effort. In the next tutorial, we're going to start to learn how to quilt the outer border zone, and we'll do it in a completely different design. So see you soon.